The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 50 Agents and Ammunition. The Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army convened in the Great Hall. Linda had a tearful reunion with her daughter, who admonished the older woman for putting herself in so much danger at Gringotts Bank. Still, Hermione could not stay angry at her mother, particularly when she heard the brief version of the story of how Linda had helped destroy the cup, and how the cup had tried to make the woman think. There were surprisingly few casualties, likely in large part because of the nervous and jittery aims of the Death Eaters, who still had copious amounts of unhinged binge running through their bloodstreams, interacting rather deplorably with their magic. Remus Lupin and one of the Weasley twins had been badly injured, but were safe and on the mend, thanks to Madame Pomfrey and Linda. A few people had small lacerations or burns, as well as a handful of broken bones. One young fighter had been left for dead by Bellatrix, who had used a modified Sectum Sempra curse, but she had been found rather quickly and taken for healing. Her fate had been uncertain for a time, but she had turned the corner and was stable. Likewise, Severus Snape had been healed of his injuries from the overprotective Jugson. Dumbledore's army plus the handful of sympathetic Slytherins had gathered in the Great Hall with the rest of the crowd. Dumbledore was being greeted by cries of disbelief from every corner. Neville and Pansy were holding hands, seated by themselves at a table. Ron and Luna were organizing platters of food and drinks that several elves had magicked into the room for the fighters. Hermione and Draco were listening to stories of skirmishes from Theo, the twins, and several others. But there was a general sense of unease. Many of them had seen Harry Potter during the course of the battle. Some had even fought alongside him at moments. But the last two to have seen him, Sirius and his mysterious friend, did not know where he'd gone.
"He was with us, just upstairs. We told him not to leave the castle, that it was dangerous, him being outside of the castle. Surely he didn't," Sirius said in anguish. Just then, a loud voice echoed through the room, tamping down their hubbub of voices into silence.
"Harry Potter is with,"
the cold voice said.
What was that? Did you hear that? What did he say? A frisson of anxious energy passed through the crowd.
"That's you-know-who," Draco whispered nervously to Hermione and the others nearby.
Why does he sound like that?
Hannah Abbott asked in alarm. "I don't know," Draco answered, confused. Now the voice had changed, and instead of Voldemort, the voice that rang out was none other than Richard Granger. Hello, everyone. My cousin, the Dark Lord, wishes for me to inform you that Harry Potter is dead."
A gasp and a cry of horror and disbelief raced through the crowd. As one, every able-bodied person began moving to the doors, crowding into the entrance hall and spilling out into the grounds of Hogwarts Castle. Hermione, Draco, and several others were rooted to the spot, shock and pain clouding their faces. Tears began flowing down Hermione's cheeks.
"He died trying to fight, but the Dark Lord was, too powerful. Therefore, it is our suggestion that you stow away your wands and prepare to join us. We will come together as one, because, well, we are the champions, my friends. We'll keep on fighting till the end. We are the champions. No time for losers, because we are the champions."
Linda Granger turned to look at Tonks and Lupin as she pursed her lips. "He's nervous, but I think everything's all right. He only quotes song lyrics when he's in a good mood." But then her eyes fell on her daughter, who had collapsed to the floor at the news. She and Tonks rushed to Hermione. "It's going to be all right, love. Have some faith. You've done this all before."
"Mom! Harry!"
Hermione choked out. Draco knelt down and put an arm around her to pull her to him, his face a mask of worry. "Hermione, you've been involved in these plots before. You know what's happening," said a calm, knowing voice from nearby.
"What? How?"
the young witch asked, turning to look at Dumbledore, who had spoken as he approached. Draco stood, still confused, but reached down along with Linda to help Hermione up from the ground. "Is this some sort of trick, do you think? Is Potter still alive?" Draco asked Linda in a low voice. "Let's just go out and have a look round, shall we?" asked Linda. Outside, Dumbledore's army and the Order were gathered near the school entrance, whilst Voldemort's Death Eaters and several Snatchers hovered near the edge of the forest. In the far distance, a trombone sounded a warbling, ominous note. Harry was indeed lying at the feet of Voldemort, and he appeared dead. There were cries of disbelief and wails of sadness from the group near the castle. On the other side of the battle there was only the occasional menacing grunt, mainly coming from Greyback. As he did not have a dark mark, he had missed the earlier portion of the battle, and was anxious for his turn. To his benefit, he had also missed the sampling of Unhinged Binge earlier, meaning that he still generally had his wits about him, such as they were, unlike most of the others. Voldemort's wand was pointed at his own throat, but the first noises that emitted from it were nearly unintelligible, so he pointed his wand back at Richard to speak for him. Okay then." Richard cleared his throat and started again. "As I was saying, with Harry Potter dead, we think it best if everyone in the Order would just join forces and lay down their weapons. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." Voldemort was growing more and more agitated, and finally removed the wand from the man's throat with a slight look of disgust at him. Instead, he turned the wand on Lucius.
"Speak for me!"
came the high, cold voice. "Yes, well, the time has come, as Richard was saying, for the fighting to end. As you see, Harry Potter is—" At this, Lucius gestured to the ground, but was as surprised as nearly everyone else to see that the boy was no longer lying there. A brief panic broke out. Voldemort's incomprehensible garble seemed to ask the question on everyone's mind. Where was Harry Potter? In the confused melee, the magical cage holding Nagini captive broke open, and the snake fell to the ground. She climbed swiftly up the side of her master, her head raised as though searching for the boy herself. At that moment, someone broke free from the crowd near the castle.
"Neville!"
An anguished cry went up from nearby. Hermione, Draco, and the others were shocked to see the figure of Neville Longbottom racing across the open expanse between the two groups, rushing headlong at Voldemort. His wand was drawn, and his eyes flashed fiercely, but despite Voldemort's temporary incapacity, it was still an uneven fight. In an instant, the younger wizard was on the ground, pinned by the non-verbal curse thrown at him. A few Death Eaters cackled at his predicament. having been there themselves more than once. As the rumblings of the Death Eaters grew, a lone voice from the side of the Order rang out clearly. "Neville, catch!" Arcing high in the air was the sword of Gryffindor. It was freshly unsheathed from its pocketbook scabbard, where it had nestled amongst Augusta's collection of napkins, sweets, and her favourite lipstick. Now the sword flew upwards in an arc, then crested. It began its descent slowly at first, then quickly, hilt first. It flew swiftly towards the young man on the ground, who caught it deftly. Voldemort's pinning curse on Neville broke due to his surprise at the sudden intrusion of the woman with the sword. The young wizard jumped to his feet, gripping the sword in both hands and swinging it mightily, all in less than a few seconds. As the sword swung on its second upwards trajectory, this time controlled by Neville, all Voldemort could do was stare in shock as the head of his beloved snake parted company with its body. The garbled yell that tore past his numb lips could not form into intelligible words, even if he'd still had the power of proper speech. His lovely, his most loyal, his precious, his Horcrux, gone forever. But Richard was feeling nearly the same level of shock, because as the older woman's voice rang out, as her imposing vulture hat and signature red pocketbook swam into Richard's view, recognition overtook him, causing him to do a double take. "Vulture," he whispered aloud. After all these years, it was hard to believe that it was possible. But it was her, he thought excitedly. Years before, when Richard was first recruited into MI6, he'd been assigned to a seasoned, long-time agent for training. She'd taught him everything he knew, but he had been certain it wasn't everything she knew. She'd put him through his paces, and they'd served on several missions, first with him as a junior agent, and her running the mission, then occasionally as co-agents. Then, as was sometimes the case within the ranks of the MI6, Vulture had vanished. It had happened not long after Hermione had come to them, Richard remembered. Vulture had been so excited, so proud to hear that Richard was becoming a father. She'd brought him a lovely, hand-stitched blanket for the baby, and had told him that her own son was expecting a baby soon. And then she was gone. As was typical in MI6 circles, little was said about it to the other agents that Vulture had worked with. By then, he himself was starting to take on fewer assignments due to his new little family. He'd only heard that Vulture had retired because of family issues. Richard had often wondered about the older woman, her son and grandchild, and what had happened to her. Apparently, judging from the pandemonium erupting around her, quite a lot had been happening in her life. The members of the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army seemed to take the snake beheading as the catalyst for attack. With a roar, they rushed as one towards the dwindling group of gathered Death Eaters. From behind Voldemort's followers, a booming drum beat announced the arrival of several additional fighters to join the Order of the Phoenix. They were led by a red-haired man who had to be a Weasley, and a rotund gentleman wearing green pajamas. They yelled as they came, and Richard thought wildly at first that they'd brought their own percussion section. But then he realized that it was only the giant's drums approaching from the forest. It appeared that, repelled from the forest by Voldemort's spell, the giants had finally at long last formed a band that now marched angrily towards them. And the marching band refused to yield. At the first trumpet blare, the fighters nearest the castle turned towards the safety of the building, with good reason. Between the stomping feet of the giants and their loud percussive accompaniment, the outdoors was no longer safe. One giant dropped a cymbal, and it fell with a vertical crash. It thudded with a harsh clang, neatly slicing in half the body of Antonin Dolohov, who had been attempting to stun the giant. At this gruesome and horrific sight, everyone raced towards the castle to take cover. Few of the Death Eaters made a move to fight. Those that did were vastly outnumbered. The sole exception was Fenrir Greyback, whose snarling, savage teeth snapped and frothed with spittle. His 4 wolf hands and feet covered the ground much faster than everyone else, but Richard had clocked him from nearly his first step. Still, the panicked and in some cases overly caffeinated crowd between him and the werewolf made it difficult to keep up. He looked to his left, more than a little surprised and pleased to see Lucius keeping pace with him. Just inside the castle doorway, Linda was trying to direct students into the great hall as Hermione tried to push her mother behind her body to keep her safe. The sight of Hermione must have been like that of a siren to the rabid creature. He sprang towards her, seizing her by the shoulders and knocking her wand to the side. From behind her daughter, Linda pushed futilely at the werewolf's gnarled fingers. Likewise, Draco rushed from across the corridor towards his witch, grabbing at the wolf's arms and shoulders. Fenrir shoved, scratching at Draco, then leaned his gleaming teeth over his prey. Richard finally reached the brute, looping his strong right arm around the werewolf's torso. He pulled, twisting to rip Greyback off his daughter. With an effort, he threw the pungent wolf to the ground. Instantly, the wolf launched himself up at Richard, yellowed eyes glowing incensed and greedy at the sight of the man who'd been so quick to annoy him over the last year. He leaped onto Richard, throwing him back to the ground, pinning down the Muggle man's strong arms with his sharp claws. With a speed and cognizance of which Richard was heretofore unaware, Lucius reached into the Muggle man's open jacket, finding the Walther PPK inside. He pulled, yanking it free of the holster. He appeared to look at it for a moment as though trying to decide which end did what task, but then came to a decision. He pushed the barrel of the gun into Fenrir's back and fired. In the tumult and frenzy of the battle, the gunshot made everyone pause in shock for a moment before resuming their stampede into the castle. Fenrir dropped onto Richard, dead, pinning him further to the floor. Draco and Lucius pulled him free and helped him to his feet. "Richard, I used your Jun," Lucius said, with the awe and wonder of a small child discovering a new toy. "Yes, thank you, Lucius, Richard began, but ducked quickly as Lucius waved the gun around haphazardly. "Let me have it back, please." He accepted it gratefully from the blonde wizard, re-engaging the safety and reholstering it swiftly. "I owe you a serious debt of gratitude, Lucius. I'm glad you had a view to a kill. Thank you." The 2 men grasped hands briefly, just as Narcissa appeared in the doorway of the great hall.
"Everyone, this way!"
The Grangers and Malfoys hurried with several others across the cavernous entrance hall. They entered the large room just as Harry Potter threw off the magnificent cloak of invisibility for a second time that night to confront a wizard who was now mostly mortal. Chapter 51. The Clash and the Classified. Harry Potter stood across the great hall from the Dark Lord, the round discs of his glasses reflecting the luminous candlelight above. "I don't want anyone else to try to help,"
It's got to be like this. It's got to be me," Potter called to the crowd, which had startled at his sudden appearance. It was the latest in a series of shocks for everyone. Finding Dumbledore to be alive had been confounding for many. Seeing Sirius Black roaming free and apparently in a relationship with a mystery man had been highly surprising. And just now, witnessing Lucius Malfoy kill a vicious werewolf to protect a Muggle had been more than slightly mind-boggling. To see Harry Potter alive and ready to take on Lord Voldemort again was just another stupefaction amongst many. Potter and Riddle, now both as close to mortals as one might imagine, faced off again against each other as the crowd grew silent. Richard drew Linda into his embrace and flitted his eyes to check on their daughter nearby. Hermione and Draco held hands as Hermione's tears tracked down her cheeks in worry for her friend. Lucius had pulled Narcissa close to him, as nearby Lobo did the same with Tonks. To his slight surprise, his two Fixer-Elixir business partners, Sirius and Quentin, held hands as they looked on fearfully at the standoff. Good for them, he thought. The two men appeared to be standing at the bedside of the potions master, Snape. The hook-nosed professor was heavily bandaged, but was sitting up, and happened to look at Richard as Richard looked at him. Snape sneered at him briefly, then looked back at Potter and the Dark Lord. As Richard's eyes continued to travel the room, they landed upon the piercing gaze of Vulture. She nodded knowingly at him, recognizing him. He nodded back with the tightest of smiles. Then both agents shifted their gazes back to Voldemort and Potter. By now, the lidocaine was beginning to wear off enough that the older wizard could be generally understood again, albeit with a bit of difficulty.
"You, the boy who survived by accident because Dumbledore was pulling the strings,"
Voldemort sneered. Several heads in the room turned to look at Dumbledore now, who stood in the corner of the room with a man who looked a lot like him, as well as Minerva and the healer who'd helped him with debridement all those months before. After a moment, Voldemort seemed to see what they were seeing, and stumbled a bit in surprise.
"No!"
"Afraid so," Potter said. "He's still here, just like I am. Was it an accident that I didn't defend myself tonight, and still survived, and returned to fight again?"
"Accidents!" Voldemort sneered at him. "Accidents and chance!"
"You don't learn from your mistakes, Riddle, do you?" Potter asked.
"You dare!"
It was Potter's turn to sneer. "Yes, I dare. I know things you don't, Tom Riddle. I know lots of important things that you don't. Want to hear some before you make another big mistake?"
"Is it love again? Dumbledore's favorite solution, love, which he claimed conquered death?"
Voldemort scoffed. "It was the love of Dumbledore's friends that saved him, and love from my mother that saved me all those years ago." Voldemort huffed in amusement.
"I have it on very good authority that love means nothing."
Potter replied, "Love means everything, Tom." With an iron grip, the young scar-faced wizard raised his wand even higher, pointing it directly at the Dark Lord's chest. 2 spells were cast. 2 voices rang out in the silence. 2 jets of light arced into the space above the crowd.
"Avada Kedavra!"
"Expelliarmus!" The spells collided in midair, the red streak from Potter's wand mixing and blending with the green streak from Voldemort's. Each stream of light adjusted to a golden hue, and before anyone could realize it, more streams of golden light burst and flowed from the center above them. The light streaks formed a cage around the two wizards, reminiscent of the one that Voldemort had used to protect Nagini. Harry strained with the effort to maintain the connection, both of his hands gripping hard around the wand of holly and phoenix feather. Meanwhile, Voldemort, who had always struggled to maintain connections of any sort, seemed to be trying his level best to overpower the younger wizard. He grinned maniacally, lifting the fingers of his left wand in the air to magically summon his second wand from his inner pocket. His flinty stare settled on Potter, as if to say, "Try and stop me now that I've got 2 wands working against you." But Potter only grinned wider, in hardened amusement. He focused on pushing against the Dark Wizard with all his might, forcing his power, his love for the people around him, back at Riddle. It was too much for the wand of Yew, and for the wand of MacDonald's. With a blast, Voldemort was knocked from his feet. The Yew wand was forced from his clutches and went sailing end over end to its new master, the owner of its twin core, Harry Potter. Voldemort fell back as though dead, clutching at what would be his final straw. A great cheer went up, and a clamor of voices and hands pelted Harry from all sides. Friends clapped him on the back and kissed his cheeks or caressed his hair. The handful of remaining Death Eaters cowed together, subdued by Flitwick, Hagrid, Shacklebolt, the Weasleys, and McGonagall. And Richard Granger was hurrying to the side of his presumably deceased, supposed cousin, Tom Riddle. He was closely shadowed by Linda and the Malfoys. As he crossed the room, he made brief eye contact with the other 3 current and former members of MI6 in the vicinity. "Is he dead?" Richard heard Lucius ask their wives behind them.
"I don't know, but I have a feeling if he isn't, he will be soon,"
Richard heard Narcissa murmur behind him. Too right, he thought. The 4 of them reached the prone body, and Richard put his fingers on the grey neck of the man formerly known as Lord Voldemort. After a moment he located a pulse, thready and erratic, but there. The man, or whatever he was, still lived, tied to his earthly body by none other than the existence of the boy across the room, who was being lauded for his death. The force of the curse had merely pushed Voldemort backwards, knocking him unconscious. Looking up furtively at Tonks, Lobo, and Vulture, he gave the smallest of head shakes, followed by a discreet hand signal, 2 fingers held down loosely at his side. It was a signal left over from their intelligence days that simply meant, "On to Plan B." "I need you to levitate him, quickly, somewhere else. Another room nearby," Richard whispered to Narcissa. Her glance flitted to a nearby door, and he nodded minutely. He turned to Lucius. "Lucius, I think it best if you stay out here, all right? Keep everyone's focus away from that door, yes?" Lucius's eyes blazed in kinship for his friend. He knew he'd made the right choice, following Richard Granger into battle. "Yes, I can do that," he reassured him firmly. "Okay, then," Richard agreed. The blonde wizard walked away, and Richard turned to Linda, speaking quietly. "Stay with Lucius and help him out, all right?" Linda bit back a smile and nodded her agreement. Narcissa levitated the body towards the door, into the nearby room, and Richard was glad to see Lobo approaching from nearby, opening the door with his wand to allow the witch and her sizable burden entry. Richard and Lobo followed her and Voldemort's body in, and they were quickly joined by Tonks and Vulture. Vulture was the last into the room. She closed the door and turned to give Tonks and Lobo the inconspicuous hand gesture that each MI6 agent recognized that helped them identify themselves to each other. Lobo raised his wand and cast a non-verbal Muffliato spell on the room.
"He's not actually dead?"
he asked Richard. "No. What shall we do?" Richard looked around the room at the small group gathered there. Linda and Lucius stood several feet outside the door, watching the ongoing celebration in front of them.
"What do you think they're doing in there?"
Lucius said quietly to her. "Hopefully ending this," Linda said through gritted teeth. "Nice work with the gun, by the way. Thank you for saving Richard's life, Lucius."
Lucius nodded.
"I feel that I got lucky back there. Richard thanked me and said that he was glad that I had a view to a kill. But to be entirely honest, I simply pointed the gun, did you call it? I just closed my eyes and hoped that I would hit Greyback and not Richard."
Linda struggled with her panicked relief for a moment before she spoke. "Well, I suppose you must have a golden eye, then."
Lucius nodded sagely. "Yes, I suppose so. Whilst I have you here alone, there's something else I wish to discuss. I feel that I owe you an apology, Lady Linda. I confess, I thought you were an assassin until today. I was mistaken."
Linda smiled thinly, still trying to process the fact that her husband nearly died only moments ago. "It's all right, Lucius. Until today, I thought of you as a Nazi."
Lucius gasped. "How did you know I was a Not?"
Linda struggled to understand. "Lucius, exactly what are we talking about, just so we're on the same page?"
"My mother's maiden name was Not. You said that you thought of me as a Not, see?"
Linda closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself not to laugh. "I do see. Perhaps Narcissa mentioned it to me in passing, and that's how I knew."
"Ah!"
Lucius nodded, and turned to survey the room again. People were filling plates of food, and 2 matching Weasleys were tapping a keg of butterbeer. Potter was surrounded by admirers. In one corner, Draco and Hermione stood watching their friends celebrate with tired but relieved smiles. Hermione caught the eye of Linda and blew her a tiny kiss across the room. Linda pretended to catch it and put it in her pocket. Lucius turned back to her, one more question lingering in his mind.
"Linda, do you think that Richard will render the Dark Lord legless?"
She pretended to ponder the idea for a moment before answering. "No, I think he's going to kill him."
"What should we do?"
Richard asked the gathered group.
"If he lives, he'll gather his followers again, perhaps turn new ones. If he isn't strong enough to do so, another wizard will eventually rise up and take his place. We'll never be able to be rid of him entirely,"
answered Lobo. Tonks and the others nodded their agreement. "But," Richard turned to Narcissa, "out in the forest, Harry didn't actually die. Didn't Dumbledore tell us that the pot within Harry will live on anyway? At least until the boy dies of old age himself."
"Am I to assume that there were Horcruxes involved?" Lupin asked.
Narcissa gasped, and Tonks looked chagrined.
"How did you figure it out?"
Tonks asked. "It's not every day that your wife and her friends conjure fiend fire, darling. There's only so many reasons you needed to use it to destroy a little metal cup," he noted softly. "Is that what that cup was? A Horcrux?" Narcissa asked in shock. "I remember reading a bit about them. Minutiae."
"Afraid so,"
Tonks said ruefully. "Then we need to kill him," Narcissa said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Here, today. So long as he is alive, the Wizarding World is in danger. He'll do everything he can to claw his way back, split himself again and again. If this vessel is dead, the final piece of his soul dies with Potter. Let Harry Potter live, and let die this bit of the Dark Lord."
"Then let's do it," Richard said, all business now. "Lobo, how effective is that silencing charm?"
"Decent, but not 100%. There are plenty out there who will still detect unusual sounds, even with it in place," the younger man said.
"Damn! I've got no silencer to muffle the sound,"
Richard bemoaned. From across the room, Vulture cleared her throat.
"You young ones, always looking for the hardest solution?" she smiled. "Here."
She flourished her wand, conjuring a large pillow.
"Fold it in half, and wrap it around the gun. Keep it tightly wrapped as you fire. Close range to your target,"
Vulture instructed. Richard pressed the cushioned gun to the stunned Voldemort's temple, exhaled out a deep breath, and fired twice. The pillow absorbed most of the sound, and the excited hubbub in the next room never ceased. Out in the great hall, Lucius and Linda gasped as a bit of the sound of 2 gunshots escaped the room behind them. Lucius abruptly began coughing theatrically, and Linda pounded him on the back in a show of helping. Withdrawing the pillow from what was left of Voldemort's head, it was immediately obvious that, on the one hand, the Dark Wizard was clearly dead, beyond any shadow of a doubt. But it was also immediately evident that he was killed by gunshot.
I think we can fix that, so it isn't so obvious. Aunt Narcissa?"
Tonks asked grimly. Narcissa swallowed hard and nodded. The 2 women set to work, magically healing the wounds caused by the bullet. Vulture vanished the pillow, whilst Lobo scourgified the blood splatter on the sofa.
"Right. We're all agreed. No one talks of this, yes? As far as the rest of the Wizarding World is concerned, Harry Potter killed Voldemort, correct?"
Richard asked. Everyone murmured their fervent agreement. Narcissa left first to inform Linda and Lucius that the deed was done. After a brief hug and a few whispered words to each other, Lupin and Tonks followed.
"Vulture, I can't tell you how glad I am to see you again, after all these years,"
Richard began. "Danger Mouse, it's always a pleasure serving with you," Vulture answered, taking his proffered hand and pulling him into a hug. She leaned back, shaking his hand formally.
"Augusta Longbottom." "Richard Granger."
"Ah, I've heard so much about your daughter over the years."
"And Hermione has mentioned Neville often as well. I'm glad to know he's grown into such a fine young man," Richard said.
"When all of this is over, Mouse, how about the 2 of us grab a pint, and you can tell me exactly how you went from being on Her Majesty's service to becoming a Death Eater, yes?"
"It was quite the spectre, wasn't it? Me, standing there with Voldemort and his crew?"
Richard asked in amusement. "I never thought I'd see the day," the older woman said.
"Never say never again,"
Richard quipped, with a wry grin. Augusta laughed. "You'll never change, will you, Mouse?" He smiled conspiratorially. "Ah, geez, never. So, we'll meet up this Saturday for that pint, then? 8 o'clock at the Casino Royale." She shook her head in pretend exasperation. "How does your poor wife put up with it?" she asked in mock despair. Richard laughed. "MI6 might have given me a license to kill, but she knows that I prefer to kill 'em with comedy. Come on, I want to introduce her to you." Augusta took Richard's arm, and they walked out together to join in the celebration. Chapter 52. Epilogue. Following the war, days stretched into weeks, and months into years. For Richard and Linda, life slowly reverted back to normal, or at least a new normal. They settled into a life with both their mundane and magical friends, occasionally dining with Malfoys, the Lupins, Augusta or Dumbledore, and the Jugs and Blacks. Both Richard and Linda were awarded Orders of Merlin, 2nd class, for their help in defeating Lord Voldemort. Richard hung his medal in one of the patient rooms at their dental practice, and enjoyed inventing fantastical stories about how he'd earned this prestigious mystery award for the patients. At least, everyone assumed they were made up. With the joking manner of Dr. Granger, one could never be sure. For his part in the war, Lucius was tried by the Wizengamot and ultimately acquitted. He embarked upon a new career later in life, but more about that later. Narcissa and Linda decided to take up doubles tennis, and with a good deal of practice, and a tiny bit of magical trickery, managed to enter the women's doubles tournament at Wimbledon after a couple of years of playing together. There, they were soundly defeated in the first round by a team from Argentina, 6-2, 6-1. But their husbands and children were there on a cloudy Monday afternoon to cheer them on from the nearly empty grandstands of Court 14, and that made it feel as though they had won the entire tournament, all the same. Remus eventually left MI6 and joined the team at Fixer Elixir Limited. It gave him more freedom in his schedule, which was helpful, considering how busy his and Tonks's family lives became within a handful of years. Baby Teddy soon became the older brother to 3 more little ones. As for Tonks, she was happy to pass on the mantle of Wix only a few years after the war to Harry Potter, who passed it to Pansy Parkinson a few years after that. Tonks went on after several years to become Chief Witch of the Wizengamot. Lupin took over Richard's role with Fixer Elixir, and within a few short years, he, along with Sirius and Quentin, had turned it into a major global brand. It financed stadiums, sponsored high-profile professional sports events, and expanded into the health foods, entertainment, and travel industries. In the summer of 1999, after a lengthy licensing negotiation, the magic straw finally appeared in McDonald's Happy Meals. The toys were in high demand, and within a few years were considered highly collectible, even more popular than the Thai teeny beanie babies that appeared in Happy Meals the following year. To this day, an original new-in-wrapper magic straw can fetch nearly £1,000 on eBay. In the summer of 2024, for the 25th anniversary of the magic straw, McDonald's did a limited 1-week release of the straws, resulting in their highest-grossing sales in years. Sirius and Quentin married and had 2 children born via surrogacy. Ginny Weasley was happy to help the couple achieve their dream of parenthood between her numerous stellar seasons with the Holyhead Harpies. Ron Weasley married Luna Lovegood. She became proficient at wand-making, taking over for Ollivander a few years later when he retired. Ron took up baking as a hobby, then expanded it into a business, partnering with Florian Fortescue in Diagon Alley. He enjoyed coming up with themed, fanciful creations, and even competed in the Great British Bake Off in 2016, with a few transfigurations to his appearance and a new Muggle name of Andrew. Lucius Malfoy, no amateur when it came to cakes, tarts, and biscuits, became one of his biggest customers. Neville and Pansy broke up soon after the war, and he left Britain to, quote, find himself. Pansy threw herself into the DMLE and Aura training to get over him. When Neville returned from his sojourn in 2004, he toiled tirelessly to win back her affections. They married in 2008, and their oldest son, Augustus, begins Hogwarts next fall. Headmaster Snape relinquished the role of headmaster to Professor McGonagall, and after a brief sabbatical, took over as potions master, again when Slughorn retired. He and his wife, whom he began dating formally not long after the Battle of Hogwarts, lived and worked at the school until old age. When Madame Pomfrey finally retired a couple of years after the battle, many were more than a bit shocked to learn that she'd moved into the owner's quarters at the Hogshead Inn. Linda was happy for the couple, and she, along with Tonks and Narcissa, visited the pub a few times each year for Angels reunions. Dumbledore assisted Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was named interim minister after the war, in setting up a more fair and tolerant way of life in Wizarding Britain. Eventually, he moved from Black House to the village of Godric's Hollow, and settled down to a quiet life. He enjoyed the company of his former colleagues and students, many of whom stopped in regularly to visit. He and Augusta Longbottom developed a surprise late-in-life friendship and romance about 5 years after the war. They were inseparable, and when she died in late 2017, he passed away only a few months later. Harry Potter devoted his life to catching dark wizards and outing wrongdoing wherever he found it. He was a steadfast uncle and godfather to countless friends' children. He tried his best to stay out of the public eye, granting only very occasional interviews. After a distinguished career at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he decided to give teaching a real chance, becoming the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts. In their early 50s, he and Ginny Weasley married in a quiet ceremony next to the Black Lake at Hogwarts, neither eager to replicate the spectacle that was Ron and Luna's wedding at the Burrow several years before. He and Ginny never had children. Harry was determined to live a long, happy, and quiet life, marginally aware that the final piece of Voldemort's soul rested within him. Very occasionally, he would have a bout of unexplainable anger or restlessness, seemingly out of nowhere. Whilst this bothered him, he soon learned that drinking one of Sirius's energy drinks was oddly calming at those times. For some inexplicable reason, he developed a taste for McDonald's, and found himself dining there nearly once a fortnight. But overall, the minuscule and contained piece of Voldemort within him simply lay dormant and ineffective. That didn't stop Richard, Remus, or Tonks from keeping a watchful eye on him for several years thereafter. Voldemort was cremated with his straw, and his ashes were buried by Hagrid in an unmarked grave deep in the Forbidden Forest. The only unintentional visitors to his grave are the occasional passing giants, who have indeed learned to live in harmony. They were befriended by Hagrid, who helped them form a fairly decent jazz band. They've been known to host concerts on the Hogwarts Quidditch pitch during holiday weekends. And as for Draco and Hermione, they both returned for an 8th year at Hogwarts to make up for their awful 7th year. After finishing school, they both started advanced training at Cambridge, the Muggle university that had wizarding divisions. Draco studied potions, whilst Hermione gravitated to the practice of law, both Muggle and magical. In all that time, Draco remained steadfast in his adherence to the rules of betrothal. Around Boxing Day of 1999, whilst celebrating at home with Narcissa and Lucius, Draco's father got a bit too tipsy one night in his study, as he and his son shared some fire whiskey. Lucius made a vague and awkward reference to Draco's love life. The younger Malfoy wizard was quick to assure his father that he was abiding by the strict rules of his future betrothal contract. Lucius's surprise and disbelief at this news was only rivaled by his amusement at his son's dedication to the institution of betrothal.
"Draco, we only told you that, so that you wouldn't go out with the wrong sort, or have any slip-ups and father a child out of wedlock before you were married." "Salazar's bum, you really—"
Lucius gasped between drunken giggles. Draco was so enraged that he stormed from his father's study and called his elf, Pym. After a few careful instructions, he apparated directly to the Granger's front porch and knocked urgently. Richard showed him in. Draco was even more nervous than he had been the first time he visited, several years before.
"Doctors Granger, I sincerely apologize for bursting in this way," he began, pacing in his agitation. "Hermione, will you accompany me to Paris for New Year's Eve tomorrow night?"
Well, that sounds lovely, Draco, but won't we miss your parents' gala? I know you'd been looking forward to it."
"Frankly, I don't give a damn about a gala right now,"
Draco answered with visible agitation, carding his fingers through his hair.
"So you'll go with me?"
"Of course, that sounds brilliant. When do you want to leave?" she asked.
"Right now. Yesterday. Salazar, last year,"
Draco said with immense and happy relief, taking her by the hands.
"Let's go now. Don't bother packing. I'll buy you a whole new wardrobe there."
Well, tonight we were just going to have a late dinner and watch a holiday film. I'm not sure if it's all right with Mum and Dad," she began.
Geez, of course it is, sweet," said Richard. "Go, have fun," Linda said, giving the two of them a tiny smirk. After the young couple disappeared in a swirl of disapparition, Richard turned in confusion to his wife. "Do you have any idea what that was all about?"
Linda, who had gathered a bit of what was going on in Draco's mind from conversations with Hermione and Narcissa over the last couple of years, answered him with a laugh.
"I believe Draco has been under the impression that they were only allowed to kiss unless they were engaged to be married, or there would be dire consequences. Apparently, someone finally told him that wasn't entirely the case."
Geez, he really is his father's son in some ways,"
Richard said as they chuckled together.
"Well, Hermione loves him, and we can't always help who we love. I mean, the man I love has a mouse tattoo on his ass cheek, and once created an energy drink in order to overthrow an evil wizard," Linda quipped.
Richard wagged his brows at her.
"He sounds like a right git, love. Why don't you ditch that prat and marry me instead?" he asked,
as he took her in his arms for a kiss. December 31st, 1999. Paris was beautiful as always, despite recovering from a Boxing Day windstorm. They'd arrived by back-to-back apparitions that Thursday, and true to his word, Draco ordered far more clothes than she needed and had them delivered to the expansive penthouse flat that the Malfoy family maintained on Rue de l'Université, not far from the Eiffel Tower. They'd dined on rich and decadent French food for 3 days now, and were now nibbling on simple paninis of ham and cheese as they sipped champagne on the balcony, waiting for the tower to light up, signalling midnight. The excitement of the crowd passing below them built as the new year approached, and in the cold night air Hermione shivered
as a frisson of excitement coursed through her veins as well. Draco's arms pulled her closer. "Cold? Would you like to go inside, love?" he asked, rubbing his hands on her arms in an effort to warm them. "No, we'll miss the tower lights," she answered with a shivering smile. Draco smiled back and cast a warming charm to keep the night chill away. "I love you, Hermione." "I love you too. I can't wait to spend the next year with you," she said. "The next year, the next century, the next millennium, love," he corrected. "Well, actually, the next millennium doesn't start until next year," she began in her swattiest scholar voice, but he shushed her. "I know the 21st century doesn't start until 2001, Hermione, but you have to admit this feels close enough." She smiled up at him, pursing her lips in silent agreement. This did feel close enough, she thought. A moment later, the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. He moved as if to kiss her. "Draco, we're not supposed to kiss until midnight." 7, 6, 5. "I've waited long enough, love." And with that, he kissed her. Fireworks dazzled her eyes before the countdown had finished. 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year!
He proposed the following day, on a little pedal boat that they rented at the Bois de Boulogne. Whilst their pedal boat skills had vastly improved from their first nautical sojourn, Draco found that kneeling on a pedal boat was nearly impossible. Without the assistance of magic, they certainly would have capsized. Their wedding took place after classes ended the following summer, in July 2001, in the first true year of the new millennium, as Hermione was quick to point out. The beautiful and lavish affair, planned to perfection by Narcissa and Linda with occasional guidance from the happy couple, was certainly the event of the year. For Narcissa and Linda it was 2 dreams come true, seeing their perfect children married to each other. For Richard's part, he was mostly pleased that he didn't have to pay for this over-the-top sumptuous affair. He'd have needed a lot more than 3 jobs if he'd had to. Being a dentist, a secret military operative, and an energy drink mogul didn't even scratch the surface of the cost for this wedding, he knew. He approached the happy couple, extracting them from an overly boring conversation with a few of his old dentist friends. "It's a lovely wedding, Crabcake. Truly spectacular. And so full of emotions," Richard said to his daughter and son-in-law with a hug. Hermione recognized the trap when she saw it, but Draco accepted the hug with a confused look on his face. "Sorry, Dr. Granger, what do you mean?" "Even the wedding cake is in tears," Richard said with a smile. "Dad," Hermione smiled in spite of herself, "go keep Lucius company. He looks lonely over there." Richard left Hermione explaining the joke to her new husband and stepped nimbly away to seek out his friend. As for Lucius, his son's wedding day was a day of revelations. As he and Richard stood to one side of the elaborately decorated ballroom, watching the guests exclaim over the decor and food, Lucius noticed a tall, distinguished gentleman enter. He wore a Muggle uniform of some sort, his chest emblazoned with the glint of dozens of medals. The man looked around appraisingly with a wide smile, as if surveying the fruits of his own labor. "Richard, who is that man?" he asked, inclining his head to indicate the man. Richard tilted to look around Lucius, then straightened up with a grimace. "Ah, jeez. Linda said he'd been invited, but I didn't think he'd actually come. That's Hermione's biological father." What do you mean?" Lucius's face was a study of confusion and shock. It suddenly occurred to Richard that, in all the excitement immediately after the Second Wizarding War, he'd never actually set the record straight with Lucius about Hermione's parentage. Somehow, It had never come up. Well, no time like the present, he thought. Hermione and Draco were married now, for better or worse. Richard had a strong feeling that even if Lucius wished to change that fact after learning the truth, Draco would likely find a polite but forceful way of telling his father to get fucked. So, Lucius, I know at one time you believed that Hermione was Voldemort's child. Lucius gave him a frightened look, but to his credit, did not interrupt. But in actuality, her father was a Muggle. It's that tosser, that man. Richard jerked his thumb towards the Lieutenant General making his glad-handing rounds across the room. Lucius's eyes widened, taking in the handsome, dashing Muggle in his trim uniform, whilst he schmoozed the gathered wedding guests as though he were the host for the evening. Finally, Lucius spoke. Bellatrix managed to seduce. Richard stopped him. No, jeez, about that. Hermione's mother was also a Muggle. Lucius's hand came up to slap his own forehead. Are you serious? Nope. My name's still Richard. But I'm not joking, if that's what you're asking, Richard answered with a smile. Gods! I cannot believe it, Richard. Next, I suppose you'll tell me that you aren't actually the Dark Lord's cousin. Lucius was shaking his head in disbelief. Richard was silent, looking anywhere but at Lucius. Salazar's anus, Richard! Truly! Lucius appeared to think hard for a moment. Then why, in Merlin's name, did you choose to become a Death Eater? Richard sighed and looked pointedly at the blonde wizard. It's a funny story, Lucius, but let's save it for dinner next week. For now, General Sterling is heading in our direction. He's the king of sardonic compliments, so gather your defences. Hopefully your backhand is strong. Lucius looked momentarily confused. What do you mean? Richard sighed. Just, he likes to get in his little digs when we see each other. Sometimes calls me by my old rank from when I was still a medic, even though he knows I'm a doctor and that I moved up the ranks in a different trajectory. Or he refers to Hermione as a chip off the old block. Remarks about how well she's turned out despite not having him in her life. I'm sure he's over there taking credit for nearly all of this. As I said, a bit of a tosser. Lucius looked thunderous at the suggestion that someone other than themselves might take credit for the luxuriant affair happening in this ballroom tonight. But before he could speak, they were set upon by the aggrandizing general officer. Ah, it's Corporal Granger! How goes it, old chap? The supremely confident man grasped Richard's hand in one grip, and his elbow in the other, continuing on without waiting for an answer. It's been too long! How is the medical corps treating you these days? Richard gritted his teeth into a smile. Sterling, old man, corking to see you here. It's Dr. Granger now, though. The man gave a falsely abashed guffaw. Of course! I always forget! Always, murmured Richard, even as the decorated officer turned to Lucius. And with that hair, you must be the father of the groom! Sterling leaned in conspiratorially, as though sharing a secret joke with the wizard. Lieutenant General Sterling, father of the bride! He stuck out a hand for Lucius to shake, leaning in further and smirking. Not really, of course, though I did my part. Lucius shook the man's hand distastefully. Lucius Malfoy. Ah, and what is it you do, Lucius? The pompous man asked. I'm in the import-export business. Lucius provided. It was the vague cover story decided upon by the Malfoys and Grangers, should the magical folk be asked where their obscene wealth had come from. Really? And what is it that you import and export? The man challenged with a grin. Precious gems. Goods and services. Lucius said with a raised brow. Ah, yes, well, as they say,
Diamonds are forever, Sterling enthused. From where are you operating?
Lucius answered through thinned lips. We're headquartered in Wiltshire.
Ah, a moonraker, Sterling chuckled.
Lucius growled and made a move with his hand towards his pocket, but Richard stepped smoothly between them.
Sterling, let me point you to your table. I believe we're about to make the toast to the happy couple.
Sterling sauntered off in the direction to which he was pointed, leaving the two fathers alone to commiserate.
I find that I do not care for this man, Lucius said. Calling a man from Wiltshire a moonraker is the equivalent to telling him that his feet are dirty, his children are stupid, and his wife is ugly. You aren't alone. I rather detest him a bit myself, though he gets along quite well with Heathcliff and Octavia, you know. They invited him. You know what they say about the difference between in-laws and outlaws. The outlaws are wanted, Richard said to him with a sideways look. Lucius inexplicably got along well with Richard's parents-in-law himself. He had been known to exchange the occasional letter with Heathcliff Cavendish, and had even accompanied Octavia to a couple of museums.
Still, if you ever fancy an extraction of this man, you know where to find me, Lucius offered.
Raking the moon in Wiltshire?
Lucius gave him a hardened stare, before the two men shared a small laugh. Well, if you're interested, I can always send him a Patronus, here and there. As you know, Muggles with a familial affiliation with the magical world can see and hear them, but ordinary Muggles cannot. He'll think he's going mad. Lucius's eyes glimmered with possibilities. Richard smiled a bit wickedly.
No need. I've rigged the seating chart so that he's at a table with the Dursleys, as well as Snape and his lady friend, he said, gesturing to the far table. If anyone can break that man's spirit, it's that group.
Lucius appraised the grouping, his own smile growing equally wicked. Already, Snape's lady friend had dragged a beaded shawl through Sterling's champagne. Vernon Dursley was currently trying to monopolize the Lieutenant General's attention. From his fairly lewd hand gestures, the discussion was about Dursley's business, Grunnings, which made drills. I know the way to take that table conversation from good to great, Lucius said, his smile growing ever wider as he surreptitiously brandished to his friend the tiny vial of veritaserum, hidden in his Muggle-style white tie coat. Richard laughed quietly.
Moonraker, the world is not enough for your deviousness.
The two men laughed as Snape simply stared daggers at Richard, recognizing the Muggle man's hand in orchestrating his current torture.
The wedding was beautiful, the honeymoon divine. Draco and Hermione settled into an opulent flat in London and began their lives together. There were 3 adorable children, all of whom were named without input from the grandmothers, thanks very much. All 3 went on to earn top grades at Hogwarts. All 3 prefects. 2 were head boy and girl in their years. The 3rd was Quidditch captain for their house team. In the end, Draco and Hermione raised 1 Slytherin, 1 Gryffindor, and 1 Ravenclaw. Tonks always insisted that they should have had a 4th, in order to have a Hufflepuff. But Draco was quick to tell her that they could have had 20 children and still not produced a Hufflepuff. And they lived happily ever after. Sure, there was the occasional hiccup, when their 5-year-old daughter, Miranda, turned Octavia's hair stark white one Christmas. The confusion of Heathcliff and the panic of Linda, Hermione, and all 3 Malfoys was matched only by the wheezing guffaws of Richard.
He was so overcome with laughter, in fact, that he had to excuse himself to the garage to recover. Once things were set to rights, with a bit of transfiguration and obliviation,
Richard proudly informed Miranda in private that she was his favorite granddaughter. As she was his only granddaughter, this was no surprise, but Miranda's silver eyes danced smugly at her brothers anyway. But on the whole, the Grangers and Malfoys learned to live in near-perfect harmony. The foursome and their children, and then some years on, their children's children, attended the Giants' concerts, spectated at Quidditch or football matches, travelled the world, and shared an occasional unpotioned Newcastle or ginger gin after dinner. When Richard and Linda retired from dentistry in 2010, the four embarked on a couples trip around the globe. Narcissa and Linda enjoyed Christmas markets in Germany, Fashion Week in Milan, street bazaars in Morocco, and the 700-mile Route 127 yard sale in the United States. Meanwhile, Richard was able to convince his wizard friend to branch out from Oreos, trying all sorts of Muggle treats, much to Lucius's delight. Lucius was always very careful to steer quite clear of anything labelled dark chocolate, however.
Thank you for listening to The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, please subscribe to me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at Silver and Copper, or search Great 78 on Archive of Our Own.